Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. As she said, I helped form Jaunt Studios. Was at Jaunt for about 2 years and left a little over a year ago to start independently producing VR and AR projects. If you guys were here earlier today and saw some of the earlier presentations, one of the questions at the opening session was, hey, are there any tips and tricks that you can tell us on how to shoot virtual reality or anything that you've learned? And nothing was really mentioned, but in fact there is, and I actually wrote a book on it, and it's called The Cinematic VR Field Guide when I was at Jaunt. And in fact, that's the basis of what this presentation is based on. So there's lots more information in this book. If you guys are interested, my contact info is at the end, and you can just shoot me an email, and I can hook you up with it. It's got a lot of great information in it. So today, that's exactly what we're going to cover, a deep dive, and as deep as we can get in an hour on what we've learned. And is this everything that there is to be said about cinematic VR and shooting it? No, of course not. This is an evolving language, but that's one of the exciting things about this new medium, is that it is a new medium, and we're constantly finding new techniques and new ways to tell stories and new ways to shoot things. So this is what we've learned so far. So first off, well, what is virtual reality? Virtual reality is, the definition is computer technology that replicates an environment, real or imagined, and simulates a user's physical presence and environment to allow for user interaction. But the key really is that it involves presence and immersion. It really gives you that sense of being in that environment, of relating to those characters. It's a very, very powerful medium. I'm sure most of you experience virtual reality at this point. And as much as you get a sense of emotional connection to a 2D film, VR even brings that more to the fore. So what are the types of virtual reality? Well, there's basically two different types in the broader sense. There's game-based virtual reality, and this is fully interactive environments and games that are created in a CG game engine. And that basically puts you within the game. It's like you're being dropped into the video game. But it's also just as capable of making an interactive film. And if you've seen or heard of the film Adam by Neil Blomkamp, that's a great example. That's doing real-time rendering to create a 2D movie, but in a game environment. And you can just as easily make that a full VR film that's all CG made. So you're starting to see game engines become an increasingly popular tool to create these types of experiences. And then there's cinematic virtual reality, and this is really what Jaunt, where I used to work, was built on. And this is, you're using a camera system to film a fully 360 environment, and that's making it as if you've been dropped into a movie. The issue here is it's harder to do interactivity, and it's also harder to have movement. You're only going to move within this environment if you move the camera, right? Unlike in a CG environment or a game where you can run around and do whatever you want. Movement is a lot more difficult and can also cause problems later on, as we'll discuss. And then within these, there's basically two different types of filmed VR that you can see. Stereo versus monoscopic. Monoscopic basically is flat. It's 360 degrees, but it's flat. You see this a lot on YouTube. You see it in Facebook 360 videos, and you see it in a lot of VR, frankly. And the reason for that is because it's easier to do. Stereoscopic VR, on the other hand, is fully 3D. It's like the 3D films that you're all used to, but it's fully 360 as well. And that really is what you want to go for. It's kind of, and we'll get to this as well, but this is kind of the four main things that you need for VR to be immersive, and that's 3D, because that's going to give that sense of real-world perception, that sense of closeness to objects and to characters. And we've got to be careful. I always want to say that 360 video, we want to be very careful not to call that VR, right? A lot of people call that VR. VR is not Facebook 360 video. If we start calling it that, people are going to get, oh, have you seen VR? Yeah, I saw this on Facebook or YouTube. And it's like, that's not really the sense of awe and wonder that we want them to have. If they start thinking that, we may have people drop out of this whole industry before it even gets started. We had that problem with 3D cinema and 3D television. So really, you want to be very careful on what you call VR. So why not everybody shooting in 3D? Well, it's more difficult. The rigs are more expensive. They're more complicated. There are more cameras. There's more stitching problems. A whole bunch of reasons which we'll go into in more detail a little bit later on. But that's why you see a lot of monoscopic videos. It's just a lot harder to do and film and make beautiful 3D 360 imagery. So what are the minimum requirements for VR? When I started Jaunt, I said that there were these 4 things that you see on screen. Fully 360 degrees, all 3D, experienced in a headset with spatialized sound, right? That gives you that sense of immersion, right? Where you really feel like you're there, like the characters are talking to you, like you're in those environments. And the debate was always, well, what about interactivity? A lot of people say, you know, you can't have VR without interactivity. And more and more and more, the more I've experienced, the more I've created, and the more I've made, I think that's true. Because VR is so realistic, you really feel like you're there, and you feel like the viewer feels like they should have some agency and control over their world. So adding that layer of interactivity, even to cinematic VR, is becoming more and more essential. So let's talk about camera and camera techniques and how this all works. Some of this is a little bit technical. I'll try to keep it simple. But when you shoot a 360-degree video, you have to do something called stitching. And that's because you see these camera rigs, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. There's many, many cameras on them, right? 12, 16, 24 cameras, sometimes even more. Sometimes it's just 2 cameras. But you need more cameras to create 3D, and you need more cameras to create a higher resolution and a better quality image. So when you have all these cameras, you've got to somehow stitch them all together to create this full 3D image. So the first method is called geometric stitching, and this was the very earliest stitching. It's used by the majority of off-the-shelf programs like Color that was bought by GoPro. And the approach is pretty simple. Basically, it takes all these individual images that you can see down at the bottom, and it aligns them based on like points in each image, and it undistorts the image, and then it blends and stitches them together to create the seamless image that you see now at the bottom. But the problem with this is that a lot of the times it's not perfect. So I'm sure you've all seen VR where you see these seams every once in a while where you look around where those cameras come together. And that can be very distracting. And in 3D, it's even more difficult because you're trying to create 2 eyes from each of these different cameras. So you have to create virtual cameras that are alternating left and right eyes from each of these little bits of the stitches so that you can create those stereo camera pairs to create the left eye and the right eye. And this can create a whole nother host of problems where you basically have to decide based on a different focal distance where you want to stitch for. If I stitch for something close, then it might fall apart in the back. If I stitch for something in the back, then it might fall apart in the front. So then you have to create multiple stitches for each of those levels and then merge them all together by cutting out and pasting all these layers together. So you can imagine how hard that is and why so many of the images that you see in 360 video are really rough and don't look great. And of course, we all want our images to look beautiful when you're taking the time to film all these great experiences. So the latest techniques are using something called optical flow, and this is something that we've used in visual effects. I was in visual effects for 20 years. That basically looks typically frame to frame to frame and tracks each pixel. Okay, the pixel is here, and then the next frame, now it's here. So it can analyze motion. It's used for camera tracking and motion estimation and creating depth maps and all different kinds of uses in visual effects. But now it's got a new use in terms of being able to stitch these images together. Using this, it can now, instead of going frame to frame, it can look at each of those cameras in that rig and say, oh, that pixel's here, and in this camera, it's over here. So knowing those lenses and the distances between the cameras, it can calculate exactly how far that particular bit of the image is away and create what we call a depth map, which is basically what you see there. It's a gray shaded map that tells you, oh, this is this close and this is this, it goes off into the distance. So the darkest bits are the furthest away and the white bits are the closest. So it creates this map, and then from that you can very easily create a stereo image with the actual image stitched onto this depth map. So it becomes a lot, you don't have those stitch lines anymore. It's a lot smoother process. It creates much better 3D and a better sense of depth. And a lot of the new systems are starting to use this. The Jaunt camera system now uses this. There's some off-the-shelf software and Nuke and so forth, all starting to use this technique. But none of these techniques are perfect, and you'll always have some artifacts. So whereas before we had stitch lines, now we get some of these problems where you can see in this video image here, you notice the halos kind of warping around the characters. I call it the predator effect. It's like that weird gravitational lensing around objects. And you'll see this in a lot of different camera systems. And this is a problem because the optical flow algorithm is now trying to find these different points between cameras, and depending on the image, you may have points that are blowing out. Like if you're filming a window and the sun's coming through, there's not enough detail on that blown out section to figure out what's what. Or you may film somebody against a wallpaper pattern which has horizontal lines repeating, so it won't know which line is which, right? Because they all look the same. So you run into these problems and you can get these issues. So, you know, the best thing to do is always to try to compose your shots so you don't run into these situations, because some of these are very, very difficult to remove in post. And a lot of the work of the team that I was working with was coming up with, you know, techniques and algorithms that we can share with people using the system and visual effects houses and whatnot to, in post, easily remove these types of halos. But the point is that, you know, this is a art and a science, and it's not always going to be perfect. And that's why when you look at 360 videos, you're going to start seeing a lot of this. Well, you will see a lot of this stuff, and now that I've mentioned it, probably even more. They're getting better, and it's becoming easier to clean it up in post, but it's still an issue. That's why all CG, you know, in the last session, if you were here, they were talking about all CG productions, and that's why a lot of times you shoot or create an all CG is to avoid these issues, especially if you're shooting close. Which brings us to distance to subject. This is another huge problem when you're shooting 360 video. If somebody too close or an object too close, your whole image can fall apart. And this is really all a function of overlap, right? If you have all these cameras, like if you see on the Jaunt rig there, that was 24 cameras, it's 16 cameras around. Each of these cameras is looking at particular objects and has a particular field of view. If you have something that's really, really close, one camera may be able to see a feature like a nose, but the other camera, because it's also so close, can't see that same nose. So it has no way to stitch it, and you completely lose that part of the image, which you'll never get back. So then you have to reconstruct that in post, and it becomes a nightmare. And so distance is incredibly important when you're shooting with these cameras. And each camera has a different distance. And for the Jaunt camera, it was about 4 to 5 feet that you can't get close enough to, which is the opposite of what you want in virtual reality. Because in VR, you know, you really, to get that sense of empathy and closeness, you actually want to bring people close to the camera, right? Nothing is more powerful in VR than somebody coming up to you like this. I mean, you can see people literally going back like this, right? Because somebody's in your personal space. So you really want that, but it's very difficult to achieve, ironically, with these cameras. And you know, ideally, you would have a system. I mean, at Jaunt, we went through a whole bunch of different you know, prototypes, from the Death Star to the flying spaceship to the probe droid. Each of these had different layouts, and basically what we were trying to do was figure out what's the optimum layout for this to get the best stitch. And you know, ideally, you would have millions of different lenses that could, you know, cover every object. Each thing would be so small to be able to see everything, you could stitch it all together. But the problem with that, of course, is that as you miniaturize and you know, you get tinier and tinier cameras and sensors, the image quality degrades, right? And you can't capture as much light, and so then you have another problem. So it all becomes a process of optimization to really create the best camera. But distance is incredibly important, so don't forget that. The other thing is camera motion. Very, very important. This can physically make your audience sick. If you have a bunch of crazy motion, you know, people will be ripping off their headset and falling out of chairs. I was at E3 in LA a couple years ago, and I was playing Eve Valkyrie when it first came out, which is this crazy spaceship game. And literally, afterwards, I was stumbling around the convention center for 20 minutes, like looking for trash cans because I felt sick. It's a serious, serious issue. And the reason is because of the separation between your visual system and your inner ear. In real life, when we move, our visual system sees us moving, and our inner ear fluid moves in accordance with that. When you're in VR, you see this crazy motion, and your inner ear fluid isn't moving. You have this disconnect, and your brain thinks you've been poisoned. And so you get physically ill. And this is the big, big deal. And that's why in CG, it's kind of better when you're in 6 degrees of freedom and you're actually moving around and you see yourself moving around. It's much more like real life. But in cinematic VR, if you move around, you're not moving. The camera doesn't move. Only your head moves. You have 3 degrees of freedom and not 6. So it's a very serious issue that you have to take into account. So the best thing that you can do is these 4 things. You want stable horizon lines, right? You don't want to be like on a boat, like, you know, in turbulent seas like this. You want minimal bumps. You don't want to be going on a mountain bike down the side of a mountain, right, where you're seeing all this boom, 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 boom. And you don't want to pan the camera. You don't want to turn the camera because you want to leave that to the viewer. They need to turn their own head. If you're jerking the camera around, you're effectively moving their head for them. And that, again, will make them sick. And you also want minimal acceleration. If you're starting and stopping and doing all of that very quickly, that's going to make them sick. You want slow, controlled, steady movement as possible. So to achieve this, you really want to have a decent camera mount and rigging system. And it's essential because this will help stabilize the whole thing, reduce motion sickness, make it all nice and smooth. The problem becomes when you have this, in 360, if you saw the previous presentation, they were alluding to this, you're in 360 that can see everything. The camera sees literally everything, and that includes the mounting system, like the tripod. And so most of the things early on in VR will have logos down at the bottom of whatever company or whatever the piece is, because by putting that in, it's a very quick way. You're just covering up the tripod or whatever is underneath it. But it also is this big, ugly logo down there when you're trying to make a beautiful piece. So the only other option is to paint it out or something like that using clean plates. So we experimented with a bunch of different types of mounts. Tripod, obviously, as you can see here. This was at a ball game. You want to, actually this, you're like, gosh, it probably covers up a lot of area, but the way the camera is configured, that it's actually mostly out of view, and just a small circle underneath you can cover up with the logo, or again, paint that out in post. And there's lots of tools coming up to enable you to do that. You can either shoot clean plates, where that's out with a camera and use that to blend in to the bottom. And, it's easier if it's static, harder if it's moving. And then there's software programs called Mocha or Nuke, which are compositing software, which have VR capabilities now that can automate the process of removing those rigs for you. So it is getting easier, but again, that stuff is still not perfect. All these VR tools are improving, but still aren't perfect yet, of course. We're trying to get all of these things into Final Cut and into Nuke and into Premiere. And we're almost there. There's going to be a whole bunch of announcements this next year that are really going to make it a lot easier. So we've experimented with a tripod. We experimented with a dolly. The problem with the dolly, of course, is it's pretty big. You got a camera operator. You got a guy pushing it. You're going to have all kinds of stuff, track that you're going to have to paint out. It's too much. It's going to be too difficult. So I wouldn't recommend using a dolly generally. We also tried using a slide mount. And this actually worked quite well. They're fairly compact. They give you that nice, slow, steady, controlled movement that we're looking for. And they're fairly easy to paint out. So we've had a lot of good success with that type of mount. Motion control rigs used in visual effects. Again, nice repeatable moves, but generally they're trying to really move that camera, and that's again going to make your audience sick. And also, look at the size of it. It's enormous. To try to get rid of all that is going to be a big problem. Another mount that we had that actually worked really well was a cable cam. And this is the camera actually mounted upside down onto this rig, and it has I don't know if you can see it, but there's 2 gyroscopes on it to keep it very smooth and steady and controlled. And it works particularly well in this type of environment with really bright blue sky up top, because it's very easy to just paint that out with sky. So that kind of thing is very easy to remove. So that's another mount that we've had a lot of good luck with. Steadicam, this is the bread and butter for almost every movie and television show you watch now, right? Millions of these different kinds of configurations. So we had it on the Steadicam, and yeah, great, nice, smooth, controlled movements, right? But what's the problem? You're in VR and you turn around and you've got the operator right in their face. And it's impossible, they're moving around to get the whole person and body out of that is nearly impossible, right? Because you got to paint it all out. And one situation where it might work and where it worked for us was like at an NFL or a football game, right? Where you've got the action going on, and we put a scorecard, a scoreboard behind them. So that effectively blots them out of the whole thing, and you can turn around and you can see stats or game scores and things like that. So in that type of situation, you might be able to get away with it. But in a narrative, probably not going to work. And then the best new movement solution is a little buggy, a motion-controlled stabilized buggy. And this one's from Motion Impossible out of the UK. And it, again, uses gyroscopes and a buggy that is programmable and repeatable movement, nice, slow, smooth, controlled movement, and is, again, you'd think it might take a lot more area of the ground than it actually does in the camera view. Pretty easy to paint out, and we even had another little camera on the back that's taking pictures behind it that you can use to fill in the rig as it moves. So those are great solutions. The other last one is drones. Everybody's using drones now. We did one of the very earliest VR drone shoots for North Face. This was in Moab, Utah. It was a extreme sports piece with base jumping off of mountains and all kinds of cool stuff. And we originally thought, wow, that's the older camera up there, the original Jaunt camera. But we thought this would be terrible, right? It's going to be really shaky and horrible and all that, but it actually worked really well. Again, the camera's mounted upside down. If you have sky, very easy to replace the rig with sky or clouds. And it actually turned out to be quite smooth. And you stabilize at the end. Generally, all of this stuff is never going to be perfectly stabilized, of course. You want to try and make it as stable as possible, and then you're still going to need to do a stabilization pass in post. And again, all the post tools now support stabilizing spheres. So it's actually pretty easy to do as long as it's not crazy. So with a little bit of stabilization, this actually turned out to be quite nice. Water. Water is a big problem. Everybody wants to film VR underwater. Yeah, of course, it's awesome. Let's go to the Great Barrier Reef. Let's go swim with sharks. Let's go swim with the turtles. That's the stuff I want to see, but it's really, really hard to do. Way harder than filming above ground. Even in rain, it's difficult because, first of all, these rigs, as you can see, all the different cameras, there's all kind, they're basically Frankenstein together. So water gets in them, right? You can just physically damage the camera. And also, the raindrops. Normally you can shield a lens with a hood, right? But you can't do that in 360 because you'll see it. So you can't have that. You can't really put anything over it. And any drops on one of these lenses, of course, a drop is going to hit one of those lenses. It's going to blur that out, and it's going to make stitching almost impossible. It's going to ruin the shot. So it's really difficult to shoot in rain. And underwater, of course, is also really difficult. If you were here for the last session, you could see this is one of the rigs that they used in one of the Attenborough shoots. And underwater is, kind of not very forgiving because not only are you trying to, if you're filming in 3D, and that's the key, most of these rigs underwater are mono because you've got this huge enclosure, right? So it's obscuring a lot of the scene. The optics of it aren't great. It's going to distort some of it, making stitching more difficult. And it generally only supports mono shooting, so you're not going to get that 3D. And that's the whole thing that you want to experience, right? You want to see that shark coming right at you. You want to feel that shark. And so, a lot of these are just don't support stereo. There's 2 or 3 rigs that have now come out that are doing that. So it's becoming better, but generally it's more difficult. And you also have to be very careful. These things aren't easy to get into, obviously, because they have to be waterproof. So you have to be very cognizant of, your memory cards and your battery time and all that stuff in there. And it's hard to operate. And so it's not easy. So let's talk about directing and framing and all that good stuff. Directing for VR is very, very different. We've had 100 plus years of cinema talking about close-ups, over the shoulders, cutaways, this language of cinema. And a lot of that is gone or different, which for me is one of the interesting parts, right? It's all brand new. What is it? We get to make it up. And the main thing is that there's no longer a concept of the frame, right? And you can't know where someone is looking. So how do I get them to look where I want to? How do we frame or block shots? All of those are questions, and everybody's like, I don't know. And everybody's very confused and looking for information on that. And then there's the getting out of the way part, and they touched on this in the last session as well. Since there's no frame anymore, and we're filming in 360, you see everything. That means you see your crew, you see your lights, you see vehicles, you see cables, everything. And so all of that has to be hidden, or you're going to have to paint it out. And of course, all this paint out work, I'm saying that like almost every slide, you don't want to do that because it costs a fortune. And also, it's not perfect. So you need to get everybody out of the way. And we do, VR hide and seek every shoot. Like, where can I hide? Under a table, in the closet, in the hallway. You're always looking for places to hide. Where am I going to put this person? How am I going to light the scene, right? If you're lighting a scene, how are you going to get rid of that? And the director needs to, see his actors and direct them. So, how does he do that? You always have to take that into consideration. And there's certain things you can do, and we'll talk about that. And the live preview is also an issue on a lot of these camera systems. Normally you're used to Video Village, right? You've cameras facing this way, you got a bunch of cables going out to Video Village, you got the director and the DP sitting out there watching the performance. But a lot of these, there's 24 cameras on the Jaunt rig, right? You can't have, all those cables coming out. It's only, basically they're recording to SD cards for that reason. And so there's not any, it just added a live preview. But a lot of these systems don't have that. So you have to have some way to be able to see, what you're doing. And wireless solutions are tough because, for all 24 camera lenses, that's not going to be enough bandwidth, right? So it's a bandwidth problem. So you really need to be able to look for rigs that do have a live preview, that you can at least switch between one of the cameras or two or three of the cameras to see what's going on. So we had to get creative on this, and there's a couple of solutions that you can try. The first two are the Kodak 360 Action Cam and the Ricoh Theta, and those are small consumer 360 cameras. And now there's a bunch more of those that are the $200, $300, $400 that you mount on top of the camera, and that gives you a wireless feed, 360 feed to your iPad, so you can actually direct from the next hallway over and move around, see the action, and hear and see the actors. And there's also a professional solution available now called the Teradek Sphere. And that actually, on that tripod, you have your main camera, and underneath it you can mount 4 GoPros or smaller cameras attached to the Teradek Sphere link, which kind of does the same thing, but it's a higher quality. It'll stitch those 4 cameras in real time, beam that to your iPhone or iPad, and let you do the same thing, but you're going to have a higher quality feed. So, if the rig doesn't support it, you can do something like this. It's not ideal. The ideal solution is for these professional rigs to support, high bandwidth wireless streaming to an iPhone, an iPad, or a dedicated device to actually let you see what's going on. Because, you got to see what's happening in the scene. Because the other problem is stitching takes a while. It's very hard to get live dailies quick enough. And so you're not going to see those immediately. So even after the scene where you could go back and look at it and say, no, we didn't get it, let's do it again, that's hard to do as well because stitching takes a while. So you really got to come up with a solution like this. All right, blocking and framing. So since there is no longer a frame, it takes on a whole new meaning of what this means to actually frame the shot. And one of my pet peeves is VR films that everyone thinks, you have to have something going on at all points and all times around the camera, right? You've got the dancers all around the camera, you've got, clowns all around the camera, whatever it is. Everybody thought that this was what you do, right? Because we're shooting in 360, we have to have something going on all the time around the camera. No, you don't. This is what I liken to the 3D effect, where when I was working in 3D films, producers or directors or studio execs would come in and say, well, it's not 3D, nothing's poking out at me, nothing's, jabbing me in the eye, it's not 3D enough. It's like, that's not what 3D is for. 3D is to immerse you into the scene, right, to create an emotional connection, much like VR. And so this idea of having stuff going on around the camera at all times is kind of that equivalent in virtual reality. The reason is because if you have something going on all the time, if you see these VR pieces where people are like this and looking all around, that's exhausting, right? You're going to exhaust your audience. So there's no way they're going to see anything longer than 3 minutes, right? And basically, most fields of view of these headsets are 90 to 120 degrees now. And you generally, when you're looking at something, you generally tilt your head and look 30 degrees to either direction. So that field of view coupled with that basically gives you 150 degrees limit that you want to keep your action in when you're framing it, right? The main action. And then you can have, something else going on behind you, but it should be organic, right? It should be the car crash, which makes you look, or the monster that leaps out, or the alien, or whatever. You want to make that organic. But you want to keep your main action in that main 150 degrees. when you allow the person to look around, even if it's just initially, it roots them in that environment. It makes them feel like they're actually there. It makes them feel connected to that, person, character, monster, alien, whatever, even without them running all around the camera or doing something crazy like that. And you also don't, exhaust your viewing audience when they're watching this stuff. Close-ups, over the shoulders, and other 2D remnants. So again, so many of the questions from directors that are used to film that come into VR ask, well, how do I do a close-up? How do I do a over the shoulder? How do I zoom? Does cutting still work? All these different things. The answers are yes, no, maybe, I don't know, Some of this stuff still works. Some of it doesn't apply anymore. But the thing to keep in mind is embrace the new medium, right? I always say, it's kind of like Yoda said, it's like you must unlearn what you've learned, right? And it's true, where you have to just take a step back and let go of some of that stuff and embrace this new medium and really figure out, what it takes to create new shots. And again, this is a lot of stuff that we've learned, but it's certainly not the end of the discussion, and there's so much more to be had, and this is an evolving story. And in fact, this book that was written is an evolving book. It's being updated as new stuff comes along. So close-ups and distance. Again, even in filmmaking, right, in 2D you do a close-up, but it's not really any closer, it's just bigger, right? It's usually a telephoto lens or whatever, but it's just bigger on screen. But in 3D filmmaking, and especially in VR, you can actually do a close-up, either by taking the camera closer or having the actor get closer to the camera. And that actually makes it feel closer because, again, it starts to get in your personal space, and they really step forward in 3D. And so that's really the way to do it. The 2D version was really just a big up, right? It wasn't a close-up, it just got bigger. And it's a better way to do it because that movement and being closer really draws your attention to that subject and makes you, more empathetic with them. So depending on the rig, you really want to strive for a distance of between 2.5 to 30 feet. And the reason for that is 2.5 feet is, as close as you can get without starting to go cross-eyed. Past 30 feet is where distance starts to drop off. So past that, everything just kind of flattens out like infinity in the landscape. And so basically you want to be in those two extremes, but you also have to take into account the maximum distance that you need to be away from your particular camera rig, right? And each camera rig will state what typically is its maximum distance, minimum distance, and again, for the Jaunt rig, it was 5 feet. And for most spherical type cameras like that, they're generally about 4 or 5, 6 feet. Which again is, you want to get closer than that. So if you want to get closer than that, what we've done is you can shoot the scene in 3D without the actor, and then shoot the actor, green screen or in the same environment with a stereo camera pair, and then comp them in for those shots where you really want to get super close. But you want to do it with the same lighting, and you got to be careful how you do it, but it actually works quite well. So coverage and cutting, so can you cut? And they were also talking about this in the last session, and it's very true. Yes, you can cut, but you have to slow the pace down. You've got to really slow it down to give people time to acclimate. This was true in 3D films as well, even within the rectangle. If you cut, people are trying to figure out where they are. One of the pieces that we did at Jaunt was called Invisible. It was with Doug Liman, and it was a 5-part series, one of the first 5-part series, and we learned a lot. This is where we were, it was a year and a half ago, but first time we'd worked with a big director, really experimenting with how we move the camera, where we place the camera, all these different things. And if you see it, and you should go see it, it's on the Jaunt platform, on the Jaunt app. One of the things that I don't like about it is he kept the cutting pace too quick. And so as you cut, you're trying to figure out, like there's this hospital scene in the first episode, and this is where we're first introduced to the villain, the invisible villain character. And he's constantly cutting, and you're dropping into the same scene, but in different points, and you're trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and you're pulled out of the scene. Right? That pulls you right out of the scene because you can't keep your bearings. So you've got to slow it down. You've got to let people acclimate to see where they're at. If you want to cut, you can do it, but you should do what we call blinking, which is basically like you blink, right? It should kind of fade down to black and then back up into the next location. And that's an easier, less jarring way to move you from place to place. And if you cut too quickly, you're just going to tire out your viewer, and they're not going to know what's going on. They're going to completely be pulled out. The other thing is, cutting to a close-up, right? Usually we start with a wide, then we may go to a medium, then we go to a close-up. Instead of doing that, we started experimenting, and this is what I'm saying, trying to think of better ways of doing this, because, we don't have telephoto lenses on these things. You're not changing lenses to get closer or whatever. All we can do is move the actor closer or move the camera closer. So we were doing this shoot with Ryan Seacrest on his radio show, and we were filming this and looked at it in the VR headset, and it's like, well, when he's talking, he's too small in the scene, right? Because he was too far away. So the resolution of the headset isn't doing it any justice. His head's a little bit too small. So instead of cutting to a close-up, what we did was, you'd see here, is on the right side, we took a 2D version and put it on a video wall. Didn't exist, but we took his wall and made it into a video wall. So you can actually see his close-up 2D performance while you're watching the whole set in 3D. And it actually gives it also this, worked really well. It gave it this cool, wow, look at his cool studio. It's like this whole video wall, and it made it look really high-tech. But it also really got by the problem without actually having to do this cut to a close-up. So it's about, really looking towards evolving that language and how do we really make this stuff work for virtual reality. Getting the viewer's attention. This was a question in the last session. How do we get the viewer's attention? How do we make them look where we want them to look? And it's just like you do in 2D in a lot of ways. It's motion, light, and sound primarily, right? If something is moving, you're going to look at it, right? That's our million-plus years of evolution where, the saber-toothed tiger jumps out and is going to kill you. That's why you look at those things. Light, you have different light, right? You're in a dark room and you've got a beam of light. You're going to look at that beam of light. Sound, critically important. I think there's a session tomorrow on spatial sound, but sound is always important in 2D, but it is critically important, like 80% important in VR, because that really gives you audio cues, right? Again, if you have that alien, shriek behind you, you're going to look. If you have a car crash, you're going to look, right? That's just what we do in real life. So you can really use those sound to your advantage. And the great thing about VR is it is spatialized sound. You can place sound in the room, and we do a spatial sound mix for each production where that sound is coming from, right? And that's not only the location, but how far it is away and how sound bounces off other objects. So it's as if you're in this room and where the sound is coming from. So it's critically important. Also, you can use interactive to your advantage here. If you're doing a cut, and you have this availability on the platform, your distribution platform or in your app or whatever, and I want you to make sure that you're looking at this when I cut, you know where the viewer is looking in the headset. You can rotate that sphere around interactively so that no matter where they're looking on that cut, they're going to be looking at what you want them to look at. So you can use interaction to your advantage there, and they'll never know that. And I also like to say none of the above. We have to let go in VR of this concept of ultimate control over the viewer anymore, right? That is why 2D will live on, right? It's a single perspective, narrative versus VR, and why VR storytelling needs to change. You need to let go of that control. The viewer may not be looking at what you want them to look at. Let them look at what they want to look at. Provide other side narrative pieces or things going on, right? Like you could have the main narrative piece, but then these two are arguing on the street about something else and something funny is going on. So that promotes replayability and repeatability. Your friends go in. It's kind of like interactive theater, which is so close to VR, right? Sleep No More was an example that was given, and which I've used for years as a great example of VR, because you go into that. In New York City, it's an abandoned hotel, and you go with your friends, but you put on a mask symbolizing that you're part of the narrative, right? And the actors go off, and you follow who you want, and they reconvene and strip off, and then meet again, and you're learning bits of the story, and it's crazy. But when you leave, you have generally the same narrative throughput, through line, but when you talk to your friends, they each have their own story, right? Their own particular version of what happened. And so these types of things are what are really going to succeed in virtual reality, augmented reality, people creating their own narratives, right, as they go along. You can have different narrative devices and different narratives going on and a single through line, but let the viewer experience their own version of that event. And that will get them coming back and comparing stories and make it social and all of those things. Rig height and identity. Height plays an incredibly important role when you're positioning the camera, more so than in 2D, right? It's always important in 2D. But in VR, it's like first person. Everything's point of view. So if it's really short, you're going to feel like a kid. If it's too tall, you're going to feel like a giant. I mean, we had that when we first started, putting it at 5'10", which is average height in the U.S. But it seemed a little bit like you were floating, so we need to take it down a little bit. And if you have it lower to the ground, you're going to feel like a child, which can be a great device if you want to use that. But you need to be cognizant of that. It's very important. On the Doug Liman piece, Invisible, this is one of the great things that Doug was doing, is really wanting to experiment with it. We're like, put it on the floor. He literally put it on the floor with no tripod or anything next to this dead dude. And I'm like, this is going to not be good. It's going to be really weird. And it turns out it was really weird, but in all the coolest ways. Because in this scene, it literally feels like you're in the ground, like in the cement. It's very claustrophobic. And you turn around and you see this guy dead and bleeding right at your eye level. So it was really effective, and it was kind of a surprise. But it just goes to show you how powerful that is, because it is 3D and you do feel immersed. Literally, it was like you were immersed in the floor, in the cement. And it was a very strange sensation, but it was perfect for this particular scene. So don't be afraid to experiment with it, but be very cognizant of what that means. POV and eye contact. So as I said, you've got to really think of everything as a POV. When you set that camera down, what is it going to feel like? Well, just put your head where that camera is and look around. That's exactly what it's going to feel like you're there, right? Everything is a POV, basically. And that means that, if you have actors in the scene and they look at you and, break that wall, it's even more jarring in VR than it is in 2D, because it's like a person in the room is looking at you like, you looking at me? And if they take a step closer to you and get too close, it's your personal space. And so that, is both very powerful and also very difficult to do right now, because especially if they start talking to you, right? Because then you feel like you need to respond back, right? Because it is so real. When you're in a 2D environment, somebody's talking to you, like in House of Cards or something, you're still aware of that rectangle, and you're aware that you're watching a movie and that you're outside of it. But when you're in VR, you're there and they're talking to you, you feel like you need to respond, and you can't. Then there's some VR experiences where I see, they put in lines of dialogue for you, and you're like, who is that? Like, who is this person, right? And that's even weirder. So, that's going to get better with interactive cinematic VR, fully CG interactive, and of course AI. When AI meets VR, and we'll have characters and scenes that can actually talk back to us. That's where it gets really interesting. So lighting and exposure, always important, of course, for any production. Harder in VR. Extreme contrast. Usually, especially if you're filming outside or even a bright studio, you're going to have vastly different exposures. You're going to have a very bright side, say the sun, and you're going to have shady dark side, right? Like you see here. And you need to make that work. You got to have the whole scene exposed correctly. And it also becomes trickier because remember, all those cameras have to stitch together, and they have to look balanced. You can have a blown out, sun side and a totally dark side and have them fit and stitch together. So exposure generally, and actually all this stuff for cameras and filming VR is a way easier, because there's not a lot of fiddling. You don't need a camera operator, a camera assist, and a DP. Generally, that's one person, because most of the stuff is left on auto. All these cameras, we generally recommend that you leave them on auto, let them auto expose so that they get the best exposure, and then when it stitches together, the stitching algorithm takes it the rest of the way, balances all those together to create an overall stitched image that's going to work. And then you can take that into color correction and color correct the whole thing, or power window and spot correct things. And it, of course, depends on each rig and how it works, but generally they're going to be auto-exposed, because If you start setting exposures for individual cameras, you're just going to mess yourself up. Flares. Flares look really cool in 2D. This was always a problem in 3D filmmaking as well. When you have a left and right eye, this is an optical defect, really, right? When the way light hits and refracts in a particular lens. But when you have 2 lenses in stereo photography or 24 lenses in VR photography, you're going to have a different looking flare in every single camera. So those will never stitch correctly and they won't look right in 3D. They'll be at different depths and stereo artifacts and all kinds of problems. So, you know, the best thing is not to have them, which will make J.J. Abrams very sad. But if you must have them, you can have them in post later. And you really want to try to remove them or minimize them when you're shooting. And to do that, again, normally you'd put a hood or a flag up, right, to block the sun in a 2D camera, but you can't do that because you'll see that in 3D. And so really you want to try and use the environment, right? Move behind a tree so the sun's not hitting it, or a different section of the room slightly, or just rotate the camera a bit so the flare doesn't hit the lenses. You just try to, as always, in production, try to get it in camera correctly. You can always paint them out if you have to in post, which isn't too difficult, but try to get them out from the get-go. And then lastly, rigging. So how do you light the environment? Well, this is also tough because as I mentioned, lighting, this is the biggest thing on a production, right? All the lighting rigs and the lights and the cameras and the crews and whatnot that it takes. All that stuff is going to show up in the scene. So really, and I say this, it makes the DPs mad, you have to get less lazy in your lighting, right? You can't just brute force it and bring all this stuff in. Now DPs are having to learn to disguise their lights within the scene, make it organic, make it, the actual sun, make it table lamp lighting and whatever in the scene. Or make your lighting disappear. The great new innovation is all these LED light strips. They're amazing. They come in many different lengths, and you can hide them like alongside of couches or under tables. Even on the camera itself, we've ringed the jaunt camera with these, so you get nice fill lighting on the faces. And these can all be controlled by a DMX controller on an iPhone, and they are white light, variable white light, or even millions of colors. And they've got these for your homes now, but there's professional grade, and this is a great new tool to enable you to basically light organically in your scene. Or you can, alternatively, and this works for a lot of different things on trying to remove things from scenes, shoot in halves or quarters, right? Shoot the 180, meaning the whole crew and all the lights are on one side, and you shoot 180, and then everybody moves over to the other side, shoots the other side, and then you swap those cameras out and stitch in post, right? Which works pretty well if you can control the environment, right? If you're in a studio or outside and you're shooting fairly quickly. Obviously, if you're outside there, you're going to have trees moving, you're going to have people and dogs and the sun moving and all that kind of stuff, so it becomes more difficult because stuff is going to change. But that is a technique that we've used when you need massive lighting. We did it at Disneyland for a shoot we did there with massive crews lighting the Main Street Parade at night and then swapping it around and doing it all again. And that worked pretty well. But the key is you're going to have to get everything out of the scene, or again, you're going to have to paint it out or remove it, and that is a lot of money and is not an easy task. And that covers it. So if you would like more information, easiest way is to hit me up on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to get you the guide that this is based off of, which has a lot more information, goes into all this in more detail, as well as a whole section on sound and 3D sound. That's quite good, written by a colleague of mine. So I think we have a few minutes for questions. Anybody have any questions?
Hi, I'm a director DP. I'm based out of the Bayeux store on a film production company. And we've been doing some 360 projects lately, 2D and stereoscopic 3D. It's very interesting, to have to work with a vocabulary that doesn't exist. So you're sort of like, if one were to be presumptuous, then you're one of the writers that is writing the books of that is being written globally. My question to you is, we have human peripheral vision is about 120, right, degrees. What is the value of 360 versus, let's say, 180? And, you know, because YouTube has this format now, ER180, 360 has been around. I've been in a lot of, you know, cardboard, HTC Vive, Oculus Rift experiences. I think if I'm looking at about 5 minutes, I've turned around maybe once or twice.
Right.
So how do you see 360 versus 180 in the coming years?
Yeah, a lot of people are shooting 180. It's easier, right? You don't need as many cameras. You can hide the crew, all those things I was just talking about. So it is easier, and I think that's why people do it. Because I would say that if all things being equal and they were both equally easy, you should never do 180. And the reason is because you lose that sense of immersion. I look around, I'm like, oh, it's black, what? And I'm pulled out. So even if, like I'm saying, like the majority of your view is a 150 degree, say, when you're turning your head, right? And staging your action in that cone, still having that other amount of 360 behind you places you in that scene, right? Generally, like you say, you'll sit down and you'll look around and you'll get your sense of space, just like you did in this room, right? I'm sure you didn't look behind you maybe once, twice, once while you're sitting here. But when you did it originally, you looked around, you got a sense of who was here, what's going on, and that made you feel presence, immersion, and that's what VR is all about. So even if you're not using it constantly, which you shouldn't, like I said, because you're going to tire your audience out, and also even when, you know, speaking of making people look where you want them to, it's very frustrating sometimes when you sit people down, you know, especially people who haven't done VR before, and they sit like they're watching TV. And they never turn around or do anything. You have to tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, you know, you can look around. So I hear what you're saying, and that's where, you know, it's about the storytelling technique that is not there yet, and that language that we're talking about to really utilize that 360 in an organic way. That's why horror and sci-fi and those things work so well, because it's those things that you don't expect, right? But it still plants you in the scene and gives you that sense of immersion. And then, of course, what you do with it is up to you. But I feel I don't generally like 180 productions because it pulls me out. Sports, maybe, because, you know, all right, the audience is behind me, whatever, and again, you can put that scoreboard or those stats. If you're doing something interactive behind it, that could be cool. But just having black or a corporate logo or something back there, I just feel pulls me out of the scene.
Can I get you to quickly comment on James Cameron and his complete, you know,
Disdain for virtual reality. He's actually coming around, and I would say don't believe a word he says, because you know he's going to come out with a VR or an AR piece. He's already softening his language on it, and I think he just wants to keep other people out of it so he can come out and do something cool first.
Hi. The question of the camera moving is interesting because it's an inherently POV form, like you said. So from a creative perspective, there's a tremendous temptation to establish the viewer so that it's a kind of wearable rig with someone standing up. And then the natural progression is them moving around. But human motion is irregular, speed is erratic. So is there a way to have effective, immersive video with a wearable camera that someone's moving around as the character without viewer moving? In a real environment.
In a what?
In a real environment,
Right.
rather than CGI.
Right. CG is, like I said, definitely easier because you're actually moving and you feel that movement, so it's fine. But it is difficult because if you ignore that, I mean, you literally can make your audience sick. Like I don't get motion sickness, but I get sick in this stuff. Like it really, really makes me ill if it's done wrong. And I've seen those wearable cam pieces, and it literally makes me sick. There's just no getting around it. And it's interesting. I'm wondering if, you know, one day we're going to. And I've started to notice that the more I do it, the less sick I become, but it still affects me. So I don't know if there's a point where it won't affect you anymore. I think that's going to be a long-term experiment that we're all living every day, and researchers are looking into and all that stuff. But no, I mean, the most effective ones are even still, if you're like on those buggies, we did a piece where you're at a house party, right? This is like a MTV thing. and you're at a house party and there's all these people around and people dancing and stuff, and we use that buggy where you actually move, but it moves you at a slow pace, so you're kind of, you know, moving through the party, and you can look around and, you know, be as crazy as you want with your head movement, but you're still moving, you know, at this slow, continuous speed through the party, and that works pretty well. But if you start going, you know, with the head cam stuff especially, I mean, just wearing a head cam and doing this and walking, you're doing this, and that's that uneven horizon line, and it makes you sick. So you could do that, and then you could stabilize some of that out, but then you need stable movement. And I say avoid it at your peril, because, you know, you go to all this effort, you make this beautiful piece, and people ripping their headsets off because they want to puke. So, not good. Number one, don't make your audience sick.
I was wondering if there's any I was wondering if there's any research being done on visual distortion due to distance and motion, sort of, I guess, like the equivalent of audio distortion when you hear an ambulance go by, a siren, and it appears to, or it sounds like the pitch is going down as it goes by. Is there something like that with video perception, where it distorts as it moves further out of your field of vision or something like that?
I think the most research being done there is what's called foveated rendering, which basically is when you're, like in our real life, you know, the periphery is blurred. You can't see, like out here I can't see as well. So they're really being able to track your pupils, not just your head rotation, but your pupils within that headset. There's little cameras looking where you're literally looking, so that it can only, especially in CG, when you're doing real-time gaming, it can only render the area of interest that you're looking at, and then it, first of all, makes it more realistic, and second of all, saves a ton of computation time because it can just do low-res stuff over here, and then only render what you're looking at. So that's where the most of that research is coming in.
One industry that's starting to use VR lately is the video game industry, specifically Sony. And they're not just doing it for like gameplay purposes, but also for a cinematic feel for the players who are using it. So my question is, what would be the challenges in regards to creating these like graphics for VR and gaming?
I mean, it's the challenge that you have. Like I said, I come from visual effects. So it's the same thing. It's like creating, you know, all these 3D assets. That's what you have to create, right? So it's the modeling, the rigging, the animation, the lighting, the texturing. All that stuff is incredibly expensive. And, you know, currently in video games, especially in PlayStation VR, they're not as, you know, they're not photoreal. But obviously that's where we want to get to. Making something completely photoreal in CG allows us to, you know, create really believable VR experiences. But it's time-consuming, expensive, and also to create photorealistic, you know, shaders, lighting, and high-resolution level of detail models requires a lot of computation power to play that back. So, you know, in mobile, when you're developing something versus, say, a Rift, you really have to reduce the fidelity, basically, to make it play on a mobile processor, even those are getting faster. But there are new technologies coming out, and this kind of goes to your motion question. Light field photography, and then holographic capture. So light field is basically a large array of cameras that not only get the color and intensity of the light coming in, but the direction as well. So it's basically capturing every piece of light information coming in so that you can actually move around in the cinematic volume. So you can move, and it depends on how big the rig is, how much you can move. You can't move around the complete room, but you can do this, and I can see behind your head, and do this, and look around, and maybe take a step forward and back. That really helps reduce motion sickness, right? Because this is what you're used to. And so that's definitely something that's happening. But the Lytro is the company that is the most immersed in that. They had the consumer cameras that let you refocus things using that technology, but now they have a VR camera system and a big cinematic camera system. And then there's Microsoft's capture technology, which I think is the holy grail. And that is, instead of shooting inside out, you say if we want to capture this room, you'd line the whole room with cameras, kind of like motion capture, and it would basically shoot the entire scene from every single angle and stitch everybody together using basically what's called real-time photogrammetry, and reduce the mesh and texture it and create a 3D mesh of every single frame of what's happening in this room. So afterwards, I could play this back, and then I could go sit in that chair, and I could walk around just like I'm in this room right now, but back in time. And those two are the holy grails. I mean, the HoloLens being holo capture technology, I think the best, because that's going to give you basically a CG model of the scene, right? Every single frame of what's happening. And then you can do whatever you want to it. Put in a gaming engine and add interactivity and add monsters and whatever else. But of course, that stuff is not really production ready. Lots of cool demos. Some people are doing some stuff with it, but it's, takes a lot of processing power. It's a huge amount of data, both in capture and delivery and processing, and it will definitely come, and that's the absolute future, but it is a ways off to be production ready. That's it. Sorry, we gotta go. I'll be outside if anybody has any other questions. Thanks.